Listening for suprasegmentals in a multimedia Arabic dialect corpus, specifically the Jordanian dialect. But why? Well, in the US, in the last 20 years, interest in Arabic instruction has soared, and Arabic has become one of the top 10 languages studied in the US. Demand for this dialect has increased not only in defense, but also in the humanitarian aid sector. But most of you don't have a special interest in Jordanian Arabic. So what I hope you'll get out of this presentation is a flexible approach to teaching suprasegmentals, which can be applied, has the potential to be applied to many languages, including those which are lesser spoken, for which fewer resources exist, making this a valuable resource. So let me tell you a little bit about this approach. It's called the multisensory approach, and what it does is it has learners record scripted productions, like a minute from a sitcom, and it has them compare their production with the original recording, the audio. But it also has them compare a visual depiction of both productions. And this approach is very much grounded in the finding that listening and perception precede production. Now, maybe you're asking yourself, will learners really be able to interpret these displays? Well, more than 15 studies have shown that training with visual displays is effective for pronunciation research, and 3 of them specifically compared the efficacy of training that involved both audio and visual to those that only contained audio, and it found that having both was more effective. And one reason for this might be the fleeting nature of suprasegmentals, because visualizations like these make them more concrete, more perceivable. And being able to perceive suprasegmentals is important. It's important because they affect intelligibility, comprehensibility, and pragmatic intent. So the research that's been done is promising, but there's still more work to be done. For instance, studies that look at generalizability to spontaneous speech remain limited, and so do applications to lesser spoken languages. And on top of this, pronunciation training in the Arabic as a second language classroom is limited, especially after the first semester where you learn the alphabet. So for all of these reasons, the proposed study would try to answer the following research questions. Does suprasegmental training in the Jordanian dialect using visual feedback displays affect learners' comprehensibility in controlled practice? How about in spontaneous speech? And if it does, how big is that effect? To answer these questions, we need the following participants: 40 native English speakers who are advanced level learners of Jordanian Arabic, and they'll be enrolled in the same language institute in Amman. And 3 teachers and native speakers of Jordanian Arabic to act as the raters. And this research would be under the oversight of the IRB, and participation would be voluntary, and all participants would receive modest financial compensation. In addition to these participants, we would need the following materials, including 1-minute video clips from Jordanian sitcoms, taken from the Multimedia Arabic Dialect Corpus. I'm currently in the process of building this corpus, and I'm so excited that I just got a government grant to spend a whole year in Jordan making this resource. We would also need, and this resource contains hyperlinks to source videos like short stories, interviews, lectures, and sitcoms, and the target size is over 200,000 words. So, in addition to this, we would need a PDF of learner instructions. Even though I'm going to give these instructions to participants face-to-face, I also want to give them an electronic version of these and a print version, just to make the training as ubiquitous as possible. And also, we would have questionnaires, initial and final, consisting of open-ended questions. The initial questionnaire would ask about learners' background with the dialect, as well as those elements of pronunciation that they found most difficult in the beginning. The final questionnaire would focus on progress that they made during the experiment. So after the first questionnaire, we'd be ready for the pretest. And this would be administered to participants in a random order, and all recordings would be made in a sound attenuated room using a professional grade microphone. And as you can see, it would have two parts, controlled and spontaneous. And afterwards, we would randomly divide the participants into a control and an experimental group. Before the actual experiment would begin, I would meet with each participant in the experimental group to give them an orientation that would have two parts. First, I would give them an introduction to using PROT to observe suprasegmentals, and then I would guide them through making their first recording. And this process of making the first recording should be identical, hopefully, to what happens in the rest of the experiment. So, for the controlled practice, the learner would read the introduction to the sitcom clip, and this would describe the setting and the characters and the relationships between the characters. And they would also silently read the lines from the clip. Then they would record their own interpretation of the clip before comparing the original audio and visual to their own. Then they would re-record while viewing the original output to make their recording as similar as possible. And then they would repeat steps 3 and 4 until they have 5 recordings total. For the shorter, spontaneous practice, they would read a prompt related to a familiar topic, like food or travel or academic life, and then they would have 1 minute to record their answer. After doing the final questionnaire, we would do the post-test in the same manner as the pre-test. Afterwards, we should have all of the recordings ready for rating. Before we actually do the rating, I'll have the judges watch the sitcom clips on which the tests were based to decrease the familiarity effect. And to promote inter-rater reliability, I'd have the raters practice rating 5 sample recordings together, using this 5-point Likert scale, which asks, how much effort was required to understand the speaker? Each rater would listen to the recordings in a different randomized order, and the raters would just listen to each recording once and take a break every 20 minutes to decrease the effects of fatigue. For the analysis, to calculate inter-rater reliability, I would use Cronbach's alpha, and to determine the impact of training on comprehensibility in controlled and spontaneous speech, I would run 2 repeated ANOVAs after making sure that the assumptions were met. And I would use time as the between subjects variable and treatment as the within subjects variable, and eta square to report the effect size. Now, this is not the perfect test. There, of course, are weaknesses. For example, imagine that we find an improvement in comprehensibility, but how do we know that this improvement is entirely due to suprasegmentals? How do we know that some of it isn't due to improvement in segmentals? We don't. We can hope that in the qualitative data, learners will mention feeling an improvement in their segmentals in the questionnaire, but this may not happen. So that's one weakness. Another is that I'm teaching specific segmental features like pausing and question intonation and word stress, but I'm not testing for them. I'm just testing for comprehensibility in general. So, a direction for future research could be to test for these specific features. Overall, the results could support the use of this approach, or it may not. And if it doesn't, it might shed light on the reasons why this was the case, and highlight the need for simpler alternatives like shadowing. Either way, it'll get us one step closer to having an empirically supported approach to studying suprasegmentals, even in lesser spoken languages.